SG 17, Bankim Chandra and a flow of books. Bankim Chandra and a flow of books. During his stay in Baras at the Thakura met the famous Bengali novelist, Bankim Chandra, who had just completed a book on Krishna called Krishna Charita. The author had been greatly influenced by English and French philosophers, although he had much regard for traditional Vaishnavism. Bankim Chandra heard that the Thakura was an authority on Krishna, as well as an expert writer, so he wanted to take the opportunity to show him the book. Unfortunately, the book was full of all kinds of westernized concepts and various mundane speculations. It presented Krishna as an ordinary person who had many good qualities. For 4 days, taking little food or sleep, the Thakura put forward arguments from the scriptures to prove Krishna's position as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The author, being much swayed by the conviction and authority of the Thakura's presentation, corrected many of the improprieties in his book and brought them more into line with the transcendental teachings of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. The author was subsequently criticized by scholars for presenting Puranic histories of Krishna's activities as literal facts rather than pure legends, myths, fables, and traditions. Such criticism may be seen as a kind of certificate of success for the Thakura, whose aim had been to convince Bankim Chandra of just this, that Krishna was the absolute truth and his transcendental pastimes were literal facts. At the end of his stay in Baras at the Thakura received some important books from an advocate friend, Babu Sarada Charan Mitra, who later became a Calcutta High Court Justice and, in 1916, wrote the introduction to a biography of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura called Uglim Sain Tathe Alife Ohf Thakura Bhaktivinoda. Among the books sent were the commentaries on Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam by Srila Vishvanatha Chakravarti Thakura. At the request of his friend, Thakura Bhaktivinoda took up the task of publishing a good edition of the Bhagavad Gita with the commentary of Srila Vishvanatha Chakravarti Thakura in his own commentary called Rasika Ranjana. This was published in 1886. The popular Bankim Chandra wrote the introduction, expressing his indebtedness to Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura and impressing upon the Bengali public their good fortune in receiving such a great work. All copies of the book were quickly sold out. In 1883 the Thakura came across a Sanskrit manuscript called Nityarupa Sthapanam, establishing God's eternal form, by Pandit Mohan Goswami Nayalayaratna, a descendant of Lord Nityananda, who had written a very scholarly presentation on the title subject concerning this essential point of Vaishnava theology. The Thakura wrote a review of the book in English for a European journal, so that Westerners might be attracted to the subject matter. He comments, "The object of the book is to prove the eternal spiritual form of the deity. This subject is certainly not a new one, but in the latter part of the 19th century, when science is so deeply engaged in its warfare with popular belief, it looks like a new subject inviting the attention of the public. Amongst the scientific beliefs that have come to India along with the British rule, the metaphysical inference that the deity has no form has been accepted as one of the most philosophical acquisitions that man has ever obtained. The current of the abstruse idea of a formless Brahma, which has invaded thought and worship in India since the time of Pandit Sankaracharya has, with the existence of the European idea of a formless God, become so much extended, especially in the minds of the youngsters of this country, that if an attempt is made to establish the fact that God has an external form, it is hooted down as an act of stupidity. The Thakura does not use the word external in the above sentence in the sense of material, but in the sense of an eternal, spiritual form which can, under conditions of spiritual purity, be visualized as distinct from his internal essence. Thakura Bhaktivinoda cites the scholarly sources of the Pandit, the Sandarbhas of Srila Jiva Goswami, the Vedanta Sutra and the commentaries by the Vaishnava Acharyas, as well as the Shruti and Smriti. He lauds the author not only for his scholarship but for his devotional sentiments as well, not only reasoning of a healthy kind. There is enough of that superior sentiment which is called affection, for things beyond the regions of the senses. The shlokas of which the following are translations have created a sort of thrilling sensation in our heart, which we feel unable to express in writing. Late crowded scenes repeat my trial shanes unlaid mayon from ohe ta ohe char ae 430 flave ohf god olone. Wahuld blaze my haired way re ego tre holly say at ohf larvaes vrindavan, way re mates lars have no domain arwain my potting sahul say ll phoenix restin thud eternal real mugain. There are several of such spiritual effusions which the materialist and the so-called positivist will scarcely understand. The book under review is replete with unprejudiced discussions about the sastras and considerations of points of pure bhakti or the spiritual sentiment to God. We fear, however, that the young people and European thinkers will scarcely comprehend the object of the book. They may put it off to a distant corner of the Almirah for happy enjoyment of white ants and other insects with the expression that the book is nothing but a repetition of some old rejected arguments of idolatrous nature. The reason why even thoughtful men might be induced to believe this is that with the change of time, phraseology, the process of reasoning and the manner of using evidence also change, and the work before us now has not been composed in accordance with the manner of writing which is now in vogue. The old Sanskrit style has been adopted. We, for ourselves, do not attribute this to want of ability in the author, but to his dislike of the modern form of writing. Be that as it may, we shall review the book arranging the arguments in a purely modern style. Let our readers know it for certain that we shall simply reproduce in the modern style the arguments of Prabhu Upendramo and Goswami. The Thakura then proceeds to give a highly logical and brilliant explanation of spiritual form, addressing the various arguments which might be raised by the rational thinker and answering them strongly. Some excerpts. There is one more argument of the rationalist which we shall take time to consider. He naturally questions the possibility of the manifestation in nature of that supernatural form. We have read in the Hindu scriptures and in the lives of holy men such as Prahlad and Dhruva, that God made his appearance in nature in his form of spirit and acted with men as one of their friends. We are not prepared, in consideration of our short time and space, to prove that the statements made in the Sastras were all historically true, but we must show that the principle taught in these statements is philosophically safe. God is spiritually almighty and has the power to overcome all conditions of matter, space and time. It is certainly his power and privilege to be aloof from matter in the position of his Sri Vigraha, and at the same time to exist in the universe as its soul. In the exercise of his liberty and sovereignty over matter and space, it is not hard to believe that he may now and then, or at all times, be pleased to make a manifestation in nature, sometimes accepting her rules and sometimes rejecting them at his pleasure. The conclusion is that the universe in general and men in particular can never by a rule enjoy a side of the all-beautiful in the scene of matter, but God of his own freedom can exhibit himself in supersession of all rules and prove his dominion over all he created. Man sees him when he regains his pure spiritual nature, but God shows himself out of kindness to man whenever he is pleased to do so. Holy men to whom God has been pleased to show his spiritual form have often attempted to picture it to their fellow brethren. The picture, whether it be by pencil, chisel, or pen, is always made through the medium of matter, and hence a degree of grossness has all along attended the representations. This emblematic exhibition of spiritual impressions is far from being open to the charge of idolatry. Those who rationally conceive the idea of God, and by the assistance of the imagination create an image, are certainly open to the charge. There is one absolute truth at the bottom of this important question. It is this: nature has indeed a relation to the spirit. What is that relation? As far as we have been instructed by the inner tutor, we may safely say that spirit is the perfect model and nature is the copy which is full of imperfections. Draw inferences from the side of nature and press them upon the deity, they will ever remain gross and imperfect. Draw from the spirit insight and push your impressions at first to the mind and then to the body, you simply spiritualize them both. Here is the advent of God on the scene of nature. It is then that the model is to be found represented by the corresponding copy in nature. God's transcendental form also finds its corresponding reflection in nature, and when we worship the deity, in pure love, in the reflected scenes of Vrindavan. Here the imagination has no play. It is the soul which sees and makes a description in the corresponding phenomena in nature. The spiritual form thus conveyed to us is none but the eternal form of God. The grossness is simply apparent, but all the actions and consequences are fully spiritual. The man who weeps and dances in felicity when he spiritually sees the beauty of God is certainly translated to the region of spirits for the time, and the gross action of his body is but a concomitant manifestation caused by a current of spiritual electricity. Here we find the absolute in the relative, the positive in the negative, in spirit and matter. The spiritual form of God is therefore an eternal truth, and with all its inward variety, it is one undivided unity. What appears to be a contradiction to reason is nothing but the rule of spirit. And the greatest surprise arises when we see full harmony in all these contradictions. The above is only one among the many arguments advanced by the Thakur in one of the most brilliant of his essays. He proves by logical argument that the eternal form of God is a necessity if the word theism is to have any meaning. In 1884 the Thakur received a transfer to Srirampur, where he lived in a residence beside the court. His sons Radhika, Kamal and Bimal Prasad stayed with him. In October his mother died, and the Thakur, taking a leave of absence, went to Gaya for the performance of the Shraddha ceremony. During his stay in Srirampur he got the opportunity to visit the former residence of Lord Nityananda's great associate, Srila Madhuranadatta Thakur, at nearby Saptagram, as well as Abhirama Thakur's place at Kanakal and the place of Lord Chaitanya's great devotee, Vasudharamananda, at Kulinagram. In 1885 the Thakur organized a press in Calcutta at Bhakti Bhavan called the Chaitanya Yantra or Chaitanya Press. The Sajjana Toshani was published only occasionally during this period up to 1892, at which time it began to be published regularly. In 1886 a literary explosion occurred. The Thakur published his Gita with commentaries, previously described, in Sri Chaitanya Shikshamrita, a philosophical work in Bengali prose based on Lord Chaitanya's teachings to Rupa and Sanatana Goswamis as found in Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita. The teachings are compared to a flood of nectar and are divided into 8 rainfalls, each rainfall being further divided into downpours. In this work the Thakur fully describes the different kinds of impediments to devotional service, the usefulness of Varnashrama Dharma in the practice of Adhi Bhakti, the specific deviations of many of the so-called Vaishnava sects of the day, etc. etc. This book was very well received. The Thakur also published Sainmota Nabhashayam, a Sanskrit commentary on Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's Shikshashtakam, the Bhajanadayar Pa Nabhashaya, a Bengali commentary on Srila Rajihunatha Dasa Goswami's Manushiksha, together with a Bengali verse translation of Dasa Goswami's Sanskrit poem, Manushiksha. He also wrote Dasha Upanishad Chornika, a book of Bengali prose on the 10 principal Upanishads, the Bhagavad-Vali, a compilation of Sanskrit verses on the subject of rasa written by different Gaudiya Vaishnava acharyas, edited by the Thakur with Bengali translations of the verses. He also managed to write a philosophical novel called Prema Pradipan in Bengali prose, and to publish the Sri Vishnu Sahasranama from the Mahabharata with the Sanskrit commentary of Srila Baludeva Vidayabhushana called Namortha Siddha. Also in 1886, the Thakur established the Sri Vishva Vaishnava Sabha, a spiritual society, in Calcutta, and many educated men became his followers. Some of the meetings were held in Sarkars Lane and several committees were formed with assigned duties in the propagation of Krishna consciousness. To acquaint the public with the functions and aims of the society, the Thakur published a small booklet called the Vishva Vaishnava Kalpa Tavi. The Vishva Vaishnava Raja Sabha was started by the Goswami followers of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and was described at some length in the previous volume of this series. The Thakur regularly lectured and read from the literature of the Goswamis at the Bhakti Bhavan, and his son, Bimal Prasad, often attended during these years, imbibing the philosophy of Krishna consciousness from his father and simultaneously learning about the printing that was going on there. The Thakur began work on an edition of Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita with his own commentary called Amrita Pravahabhashaya. Describing this period in his autobiography, the Thakur notes, "It was a highly intellectual task for me to publish all these books. Haridhundatta Abadanganga and Kayapat came to Srirampur and offered a very old manuscript of Sri Krishna Vijaya published that. At that time I established the Chaitanya Press, which was operated by Sri Yukta Prabhu. When I had printed 2 khandas of the book Chaitanya Charitamrita, I got a very intense head ailment from all this intellectual work, For some time the Thakura could not work due to dizziness. At the suggestion of some Vaishnavas, he smeared ghee on his head, taking their instruction to be the suggestion of Srila Jiva Goswami, as he had, simultaneous to their urging, received some of Jiva Goswami's books. I prayed to Sri Jiva Goswami that the affliction would not continue. Praying in this vein and applying ghee, my ailment vanished. Again I began to work and read the books of the Goswamis. In 1887 the Thakura traveled to many places in Bengal in search of the Chaitanya Upanishad, which is part of the Uttara Veda, but found only in very old manuscripts. Few people had even heard of this work, which offered overwhelming evidence of Lord Chaitanya's identity as the Supreme Lord and Yuga Yuvatora, the Yuvatora for the present age of Kali. His endeavor was finally brought to the attention of Madhusudan Das, a Vaishnava Pandita, who possessed an ancient manuscript of the Uttara Veda. The Pandita at once dispatched it to the Thakura from his place in Sambalpur. When the Vaishnava community learned of the Thakura's discovery, they immediately requested him to prepare a Sanskrit commentary. The Thakura agreed and produced Sri Chaitanya Charanamrita. Madhusudan Das assisted by writing a Bengali translation of the verses called Amrita Bindu. The Thakura was awarded the title Bhakti Vinod during this period of his colossal efforts in preaching and book publication. Sri Padavacharya Kul wrote a letter to the Thakura in Sanskrit awarding him the title, and the Thakura gratefully answered in the same. He comments, "The masters had given the title Bhakti Vinod to me, and this was also the desire of Mahaprabhu." The title Bhakti Vinod means the pastime or pleasure of devotional service, and, taking either or both of these meanings as appropriate, it must be said that the Thakura was the embodiment of one who performs and takes pleasure in the pastimes of devotional service. The Thakura's statement that his being awarded such a title was the desire of Mahaprabhu should not be misunderstood. First of all, it clearly was Mahaprabhu's arrangement, as the scholars had not been requested by the Thakura that he be given any title. They were inspired to do it from within. What is more, Srila Bhakti Vinod Thakura was pure and able to understand Lord Chaitanya's desire, and thus there is no element of speculation or pride in his declaration. Srila Bhakti Vinod Thakura also began to propagate the Chaitanya Panjika, a Vaishnava almanac. And it was by his efforts that the appearance day of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was made a respectfully observed and important fast day in the Gaudiya Vaishnava calendar. By lecturing to various societies in Calcutta and elsewhere, the Thakura was profusely distributing the seeds of bhakti. He published a detailed account of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's life in the Hindu Herald, an English periodical, which was widely read, and the article drew much favorable attention. Thus, along with his earlier title, Satchidananda, which was awarded after the publication of Satchidananda Premalankara, and together with his new title, Bhakti Vinod, he was thenceforward known to the Gaudiya Vaishnavas as Satchidananda Bhakti Vinod Thakura.